So now maybe the most important bit of the evening is we turn to the community for who are actually the main constituents of this debate, and that is the public, hence Better Public Media. So we have some Zoom contingents who will be putting questions through Zoom chat, but we'll turn first to the audience here in person. Do any of you have questions you'd like to put to the panel? The gentleman over here and then over on the right.
Question for nice to hear that you are supportive of some of the things that have been done over the last few years, but I'm very confused by New Zealand First policy. How can you say you support Iwi radio funding, but you are so vehemently against the Māori Health Authority?
They come in under a treaty settlement, so Iwi Radio... Sorry, knock over the cup. Iwi Radio were established under treaty settlement, so we believe that, and actually I do have a background in Iwi Radio. I worked in Auckland, My FM, when they first started. I was on air there, so I have a little bit of a connection into that. So New Zealand First has always been supportive of Iwi Radio.
Well, that's great to know that you're supportive of Iwi Radio, but you're happy to support specific funding for a dedicated Māori radio station, but not for a much more possibly important thing of dedicated funding for Māori health.
Well, Iwi Radio have been given, they receive their frequencies, so it's not for a political party to remove their frequencies. So we would support them, absolutely.
But not a Māori Health Authority?
No.
Okay, thank you. Can we pass the mic across when we're asking questions?
Thank you to the three of you for coming out. I take it from your presentations, I think I can take it as read that you're all supporters of public media. Far be it from me to suggest that your statement of that position has been platitudinous to some extent. But what I'd like to ask is this: show me the money. My question is this. Miles has outlined, it's axiomatic that this country is too small to produce from the normal tax base a public media system such as the Australians and the POMs have. What Miles has sketched out in terms of that targeted levy is an extremely practicable way to achieve funding of public media. What you people have been talking about is not asking the question of where the money comes from. And what I would like to hear from all of you is, do you support the idea of a targeted levy, a targeted unstealable levy that supports public broadcasting? Because I reckon the three of you together would just about get a majority in the House for that, no matter what the composition of the House is at the moment. Where is the money coming from?
Can I say that we've been underfunded for many years now, and I agree with what Miles has been saying, because otherwise you're just at the whim of different governments who don't see broadcasting as a priority. Look, the reality was, even with the merger, as Miles said, we were still reliant on commercial revenue. You know, the merger was, while we were putting an extra 100 million in, weren't we, Miles? We were probably 200 million short if we really wanted to do the business in terms of the merger. So the principles that Miles talked about is, I couldn't argue with. What I could argue with, though, is that sadly you won't see us in Parliament with Jenny Marcroft and Winston Peters, so you won't get what you've asked for.
Is that a yes to the levy idea?
That's what I said. I support the principle of that. Absolutely.
As I've indicated in my opening remarks, the Green Party is very much open to the levy idea. I think, but I did want to push on the, while we work through that, I think we still need to increase our revenue sources, because otherwise we keep going around in circles. So it's a bit of a yes and as in the introductory presentation, we have countries with comparable population who manage to have revenue streams to enable better funding for public media. And so I think while we work at the levy, that shouldn't stop us from doing what is right and better funding our public media services.
I was just trying to look, I recall, and can I come back to you on that, because we have had a policy in the past aligned with what you're saying, but I couldn't pull it up on the internet right now. Yeah, because it was something that a previous spokesperson had discussed, so I'll come back to you on that.
It was in New Zealand First's policy a couple of elections ago.
Correct.
Jenny,
yes, before my time.
I've got here, I think, the policy you might be referring to, which is introduce a requirement for international streamers like Netflix and other international platforms with significant New Zealand subscriptions to contribute to the New Zealand production industry by commissioning local content production. Was that the bit you're referring to?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, I didn't have it to actually be able to articulate it properly, but thank you for that.
We'll move on. We've got another question back, and then we'll pick up some Zoom questions.
One of the countries that has successfully done this is Finland, which since 2013 went off the license fee and replaced it with a percentage that both PAYE paid, which was 0.32 or something, and businesses 0.6 something. But they got 600 million euro from that, and they maintained the ability of bias or prevented bias by having a cross-party commission that met regularly every year. My question is to you, Willie, and anyone who wants to grasp this, because I'm not convinced that if Melissa Lee came in here that she would run out. She's convinced herself that somehow commercial is the only way to go. Anything which is overfunded publicly is going to be pro-government and therefore bad. And she seemed to run the if it's not broke, we won't fix it sort of line, and no one challenged her, especially with the sort of submission that I made for Finland and other countries who have successfully made this. So I'm in favour of the diversity of that you spoke about, the diversity of candidates, because other countries that have also funded it have had a problem with that diversity. So my question is, who's going to make the argument for the funding that we can afford as a country of 5 million?
I think that's a good question, and I think that it's incumbent on people like myself to put those arguments up. I have to say I haven't been in that, I've been, you know, like I took over this 16 or 18 months ago, but really in terms of the changes I've got with broadcasting, I think they've probably all come in the last 7 or 8 months in terms of what I was talking about earlier. But and it's incumbent on people like myself, Ricardo, Jenny, to actually look at a new strategy in terms of that funding, because governments never have enough and don't see it as they don't see how important. I shouldn't say that, should I? But I should say, particularly national governments, but and our governments has seen it as incredibly important, but other priorities come to the table. And, you know, we've been in a cost of living crisis, so I understood why we walked away from the merger and obviously supported that. But that being the case, there's always going to be cost of living crises, so we have to come up with a new type of strategy. That's why I'm certainly open to what Miles is saying and what you're saying tonight.
Ring fencing and a charter.
Yeah, and I think you're making another argument for the levy, right? And I think I totally hear you around taking the partisan politics away from funding public media. Completely agree on the sentiment there. I think we'll have to sit down and work together on that. I think the other component that you were mentioning in your remarks around, I guess, how politicians engage in our comments in relationship to public media, commercial media, and some people having a bias. I think we're all incumbent on also as politicians being responsible in how we talk about media to the public. And sorry, just to remark on, I guess, the Q&A interview that Winston Peters had, I think like we have a responsibility to also not diminish that trust on media, whether it's commercial or public. And so I think it's it's both, right? It's about making sure that we have secure that long-term funding, take the partisan politics away from it, but also on a day-to-day basis to also be really responsible MPs around that.
I really like what Chris Trotter wrote today, that it's the media's job to elicit information from politicians, not to prosecute them. On that note, to sustain a diverse news and media ecosystem as it's transitioning to digital, because that's the biggest financial challenge it's got, greater efficiencies and value for money for the taxpayer really is at the forefront of New Zealand First policy at the moment as we try to get back in the black. We will need to maintain plurality as well as editorial independence while we do this, and that's going to really require collaboration right across our range of public media outlets, and we've got a couple of policies that will speak to that, mandating that RNZ shares more of its content, technology, its training, all of those sorts of things across with iwi radio, with access radio, so it's the taxpayer not paying twice or thrice. And TVNZ would mandate them to do that as well across the multimedia, as well as other ways in which they can support with shared services, facilities, content training, staff development, technical services, infrastructure as well. And I think that's really important that while we are in this position, let's make some efficiencies in our public media as well, because I think there are some shared, and I know RNZ, for example, does share its content, so I think we just need to take that a little step further.
Yeah, I think also the collaborations are really important, eh? You know, like we do some fantastic things in terms of Māori media, in terms of Pacifica media. We've got some great broadcasters, you know, like Dale Husband and Julian Wilcox, you know, Moana, you know, Mihi. A lot of these broadcasters are not seen enough in mainstream, and you could really, they could really make a contribution. And some of the funding that we gave to RNZ too, it's not just, it's about tapping into these partnerships and these collaborations. So totally agree with Jenny there. I just don't agree with what she said at the start about Chris Trotter, because I think it's incumbent on politicians to answer questions too. No, you've had enough.
I'd just like to explain one of the little projects I worked on when I was in Parliament. That was with Mihi Forbes. She was funded by New Zealand On Air, along with Annabelle Lee Mather, to make the New Zealand Wars series. And one of the things that we thought would be really important, and this is getting, you know, double bang for your buck, is that RNZ, which is wanting more content, and education, which needs stories of our history, for that documentary, which was around $500,000 per 30-minute episode, for that content then to be used in the classroom, to go up on RNZ's website, so that we're really sharing and giving value to our taxpayer. I think that's really important, that kind of collaboration.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to have some
question
questions from our Zoom.
Hold on, one here. Question on the floor. Hi. Oh, sorry.
I think we should. We've got 75 people out there on the Zoom who are part of this meeting.
So we're going to have a couple of Zoom questions, then we'll return to the floor.
And they include, you'd be interested to know, some very senior industry people and media commentators. I'm not going to name them unless they want to name themselves by questions or comments. But we've got about 3 or at least already. So if we could start with Gavin Ellis's question to each party. Would you consider a special tax status for news media beyond making subscription tax deductible to recognise their public interest journalism, and would you consider tax-free status?
That's something that I have to take to our policy team, but it certainly is something that is worth the consideration.
Yeah, equally, we don't have an established policy on that specifics, but I think it's something worth exploring.
We've talked about it And at the moment, the answer would be no. It's just to be, but it has been spoken about and explored. So, understand where was that from, Gavin?
That was from Gavin Ellis.
Yeah, understand where Gavin's coming from, and it's been looked at, but that's not on the table at the moment.
Cool. So I've got one or two more from Mark Harvey. To each party, what is your position on allowing for free speech to the degree that it can be hate speech and discriminatory in the media?
I certainly believe in we certainly believe in free speech, and it's all, look, it's going to be part of a review right now. The point is, and I think a lot of our communities are saying, and if I'm to listen, if I'm being fair, I have to listen to some of our communities. It's about how far does the free speech go? That's what some of our communities are saying. I'm a little bit different. I suppose I came from, broadcasting background, union background. It doesn't worry me what anyone says, but communities have approached me about, should we be putting lines in the sand? Now I can be very clear on this. There's no strategy from us right now in terms of broadcasting to limit that. But it is being discussed that, particularly with the huge influences and the disinformation that's going online, we may have to come up with something in terms of a response, and that's all part of what we're doing in terms of reviews at the moment. So while obviously supporting free speech 100%, let's not kid ourselves that sometimes it gets out of hand and sometimes people get hurt.
And I think it goes beyond just people getting hurt, right? It's the risk of incitement of violence that can occur when hate speech does end up happening in media spaces. I think there's two parts to this. One of them is that I think I go back to, well, A, they need to have progressed the hate speech legislation and to have done it more thoroughly, but B, there's also, I think this is another case for why decent, sustainable funding for public media is important, because otherwise, while I know that there's commercial media companies that are trying to do the best to have a diversity of voices and to kind of push back against some of the rhetoric and have other groups that are affected by hate speech represented, the reality is that also when public media isn't funding, it's the people with the most resources that then have the loudest voices, and if those loudest voices are propagating hate speech, that then creates a void for other communities to have a say. And so I think the panacea to the risk of social cohesion by the status quo is actually funding public media adequately so that we actually have that counter voice to potentially a growing attacks in media against rainbow Māori and migrant minority groups. And so I think this is the key role of having a diversity of stories being told that public media can enable.
I think that it's interesting to note that there is certainly a decline of trust in our media. 60%, according to the Auckland University study, said 60% don't trust the media. 70%, which is even more alarming, are avoiding the news. They're avoiding the media. So if they're not going to our mainstream media, then they're going somewhere else to get their information. And it's really important, I believe, that we need to give agency to all voices. And when you shut down voices, when you cancel them, then it's like a pot boiling on the stove with the lid on. What's going to happen? The lid will blow off. So it's important that we are able to, as a society, listen to other people's opinion, not judge them, not cancel them, not tell them they're cookers or nutters and they're down a rabbit hole. Actually, we need to bring back a bit more humanity and tolerance into our dialogue with each other.
Because I think, well, I'm not really clear on what you mean by cancelling, because I think actually there is already a diversity of views within the media landscape. But B, I think I would draw a difference between this is why we have hate speech legislation, right? I think there is something about also having a firm line when groups are actively inciting violence against minority groups. And sometimes that inciting violence also need to come from just the literal physical threats. It's about the constant dehumanization, mocking, and erasing of communities. And so I think part of us having a human conversation is being able to center the voices who are affected by that violence. And, I really do wish Melissa Lee was here because, when we have MPs who are constantly attacking Māori media and pitting against, for example, migrant community media, that is a form of enabling anti-Māori sentiment to seep through. And for the trust, to what Jenny was talking about, the trust in media declining, the trust in media declines when politicians actively are attacking Māori media outlets.
Thanks very much. Very complex issue. We'll move along. We're going to get one more Zoom question and then we'll come back to the floor here in the library.
Thanks, Peter. This one's from Matt. There's a bit of a preamble and then a question. In 1986, there was a Royal Commission on Broadcasting and Related Telecommunications, which examined the potential future of RNZ and TVNZ, etc. It was largely ignored in favour of deregulation and New Zealand on air. In the light of big tech's disruption of the media sector, now would be a good time to revisit the 1986 Commission. The Leveson inquiry in the UK, which was held in the wake of the Hatgate scandal, and the Finkelstein inquiry in Australia probed Rupert Murdoch's dominance. A Royal Commission building on the above could take the partisan politics out of media reform. So to the panellists, would you consider a Royal Commission into NZ's media sector as outlined above?
No.
As expressed, I would need to kind of have a further conversation, but at this point we don't have a policy, so it would be a no.
New Zealand First policy is a Royal Commission of Inquiry into media bias and manipulation in New Zealand.
Okay, back to the floor. I believe there's a
Thanks a
gentleman
lot.
here waiting
Cheers.
with a question.
Look, I welcome the levy conversation. I think it is a great conversation to have and one that in the production community be very thankful to hear about. But I do also wonder, and specifically around all our local broadcasters, there are no quotas. So the Broadcasting Act doesn't dictate that there is any content required from any of our broadcasters apart from a moral obligation to make local content. Should we change that, and I'm interested in your opinion on that, should we change that and get local quotas within our Broadcasting Act, which would then also cause any operator to come into New Zealand, be it a Netflix or an Apple or a Disney, to also abide by those laws?
I mean, it's an idea worth exploring, and what it reminds me of is the conversation I'd be having with actors guilds around even the requirement to kind of have local people also leading some of those media productions when people come here to produce content. And so, yeah, it's, I think, something worth exploring. I wouldn't be able to commit to any specifics, but I think in terms of your point around how do we ensure there's enough local content, I think that could be something.
Well, at any time, TV3 or Sky could get out of making local content.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Look, we're doing the reshape of the Broadcasting Act right now. I mean, it's not fit for purpose. We were set up in 1989. So we didn't even have the internet in 1989. So I think those types of ideas, and it's all going to be done, I think, over the next 12 months in terms of the whole review. And it needs to encapsulate ideas like that. You know, it has to get fit for purpose, recognise what's happening now in terms of local content, in terms of groups who are not being served, in terms of deaf people, in terms of, our disability sector. And I think the Broadcasting Act will be reshaped, revamped, and be fit for purpose and take into account exactly what you're saying.
Thanks, Willie.
I agree with Minister Jackson about the reshape of the Broadcasting Act, and New Zealand First would like it to be called the Public Media Act and bring those other entities into it as well under that umbrella. Just on a note on that content, something that I am a bit concerned about is this is, when the Film Commission funds something, it ends up on Netflix, but doesn't come back to New Zealand for New Zealand audience screening for a number of years. And there's a program called 6 Days, or a show called, not a show, it's a documentary. And that's taken 6 years for it to finally be available for New Zealand audience. So that's not right. If we're funding content, we want to see it immediately, not have it up in the Northern Hemisphere.
Can I just add on the question around quotas? Quotas are actually illegal in New Zealand. We're not allowed them through the free trade agreement, which is GATT, which I mentioned in the speech. So if you wanted a quota, you'll have to go back and change GATT. So that's why I was mentioning the other solution, which is the levy and the limit on, or the 2%, the Danish model, which is 2% on all revenue, which is then funneled back into our local production. Because if Netflix, for example, fund programs, they're going to play them as well, right? So if they're funding 5% of their revenue goes to New Zealand productions, then all those programs will go onto Netflix and we'll see them. So it's a way around the quota without having to change GATT, which is impossible, I would say.
There used to be an argument in commercial radio a number of years ago, which was about playing New Zealand music. There should be a quota on our local radio stations. And that was, the argument was, we don't have enough good music. New Zealanders aren't producing enough good music that we can play on our CHR radio stations or whatever.
Self-imposed quotas at that point.
Yes, absolutely. So we don't have that issue now. We do make extremely good content, and we should all be very proud of it.
Thanks very much. Now, there's a question at the front, and then two questions at the back, and then we'll go back to Zoom.
The lady in the brightest coat in the room. Right, the first woman to ask a question tonight. However, right, so the elephant in the room, it seems to me, as someone, I was a journalist for 20 years, and then I trained as a lawyer, and now I work as a lawyer in media, and I teach media law, and I teach media law to journalists and to lawyers. So that's very interesting, because I always say to both groups, what's your source of news? And they don't say the Herald. They don't say Radio New Zealand. Then this is the future, right? This is the future. They say TikTok. They, yeah. And if they want to Google something, they don't go to Google. So to me, the elephant in the room here is also the AI generative. We haven't talked about this. We haven't talked about ChatGPT and Bard, and what's the other one? Bing Chat? Bing Chat, whichever way around. Anyway, they are still an opportunity to steal journalism in this country, which is what I saw when I was a journalist for 20 years. I'm so sick of having my stuff stolen. And this is another opportunity for it to be stolen, and yet none of the talking tonight seems to address this is the next generation. It's not Radio New Zealand and talking about the Herald. It's talking about that, and I want to know how you're going to address that, because that is the absolute future for us, and that is, those tech companies are going to keep stealing our content. They are going to do it from journalists, and it's going to turn journalists off being journalists. It's going to take away their income, and that's been the big problem. That's why older, more experienced journalists walk away, because they can't live the way the system's set up. Okay. Much as I personally do support a tax or a levy, I think that would be great.
Would you like to respond?
Thank you for that. I think as I got introduced as a projectionist at the beginning, and my job was actually replaced by a literal machine. So I kind of hear you there. And I do think we're not, as legislators, I think we're slow to the game of kind of thinking how artificial intelligence will impact jobs, how it will impact other things. So I think we should be considering that. And I think better funding for public media can help protect jobs in that space as well, and evolve that kind of thing, that changing game as well as protecting our tertiary education institutions that actually create the pipeline of people who go into that workforce. But I think in terms of whether we need to pay more attention into how we protect our industry from emerging technologies that ultimately will exist more within the commercial realm, is something that we should absolutely keep a keen eye on as well.
It's the intellectual property.
Yeah.
We're not protecting the intellectual property, and so that's what you've really got to be looking at. That's good. You've got to really address, how we're going to do it.
And emerging technologies could also end up putting and jeopardizing jobs in newsrooms as well. And I think I take your point, it's intellectual property, and it's also about having a just transition as emerging technologies come in. As I wouldn't be able to give you an answer in terms of how we tackle AI. I'd be keen to have a conversation on that, but all I'm saying is I'm acknowledging that as legislators, we're slow to the game of responding to those emerging technologies.
Well, look, journalists are inherently...
Let's have an answer.
I was just saying that journalists are inherently lazy in some respects, and so if an AI bot can knock together some figures and throw out a graph, great. That leaves you time to do the personal one-to-one questioning of people, of politicians, for example. Okay. You know, but you've got to find a way to make it work. Yeah,
no, I totally accept what you're saying, but in terms of the AI, it'll all be part of the whole broadcasting review in terms of what's happening with the Broadcasting Act, because it's, again, something new that's come onto the scene. Look, I don't apologise as a government for focusing on what hasn't been focused on properly for the last 20 years, which is our national public providers. You know, we're talking about RNZ, we're talking about TVNZ. I know people will say, well, why are you doing that? Because all the young ones are, they're on the internet. Well, if we don't, then who does? You see? If we don't, who does? It's like Māori. You know, I chaired Māori radio, Māori media for 10, 12 years. You know, we didn't. I was the chairman of 21 stations. I was the chairman of Māori television for all our communities. I was electoral college chair. They told us no one was watching us. They told us no one was listening to us. So what the hell were we doing supporting this? You see? We support it because the culture is so important. We support it because the language is so important. And it deserved investment, and it deserves investment today. And those are our priorities. And in terms of RNZ and TVNZ, you know, they're still trusted sources, and those types of entities are such an integral part of every other developed nation who've had the proper investment. But we haven't given the proper investment. So, you know, now's the time for us to do that. And what you're talking about is really important too, and we'll encapsulate that in the Broadcasting Act review. But we've got to, look after what's in front of us to start off with, or no one else will.
Jenny, you've got a comment on the AI question?
Just really sort of very briefly, that's about exerting our own sovereignty over our own content that we're producing. So I just acknowledge that, and obviously the work that the Minister is doing. I haven't seen what that looks like, so certainly I'm sure after your comment today, he'll make sure that's focused on that, and I'd like to see what that looks like, most definitely. Thank you.
There's a lady at the back over here, and then another question at the back, and then maybe we'll see if there's more Zoom questions.
Hi, my name's Shamina Smith, and I work for a tech policy think tank called Brainbox. This is a question for all of the panellists. Do you believe that media literacy is important? And if so, what's your perspective on the government's role in supporting media literacy initiatives?
Nobody's grabbing the mic.
It is important. In terms of how we strengthen it, I think it needs probably a range of interventions. I think some of it can be around making sure that our education institutions are fit for purpose to kind of so for example, even just thinking of tertiary education institutions actually being resourced so that we can have not just the courses that are thought of as kind of commercially viable, and I think that's kind of part of the conversations we've been having. But I absolutely think that, as per one of the previous questions around emerging technologies and channels in which news and information is distributed, media literacy is becoming more and more of an issue, because then how people access the news can be a huge challenge. And I think that the conversation we will need to be having with social media giants around, for example, how we ensure that information is presented in a way that honors the legitimacy of the sources will continue being critical, because in a kind of low media literacy landscape, the ability to have that information by the public is now being compromised. So, yeah.
Willie, Jenny, did you have a comment?
I support what you're talking about, and again, It's part of everything, all the different new developments in terms of what's happened with the media. You know, AI, you name it, right across the spectrum. And so I support it, and it's being reviewed right now along with everything else that's come to the table.
I mean, I think we can all agree that we have really good, strong regulation around our traditional media and social media, where a lot of people are getting their news and information. It's pretty much the Wild West, and it's there in that space that we need to put our minds as to what needs to happen there. New sheriff is needed.
Now, there was a question at the back and then the lady at the front.
Hey guys, I've got a couple of questions about the screen production rebate. The ACT Party wants to scrap the international and the domestic rebates, even though multiple studies have demonstrated that the return on investment is upwards of 600%. Will everyday New Zealanders be better off if those rebates are scrapped? And secondly, is our international rebate at 20% competitive enough?
We don't have policy on that, but the only comment I'd really make is this is the hidden right-wing agenda we're seeing in play, and that's the austerity that will come through if ACT has too much power.
Yeah, well, I support what you're saying. It's a bit of a right-wing agenda going on there in terms of that, and I think we're all aware of it.
I think there is a lot that we can do to better support domestic productions. Getting rid of the rebates is not one of those.
Okay, thank you very much. There was a question at the front. No, a question at the front first.
Really quick one. Jenny, you said you wanted to abolish the Broadcasting Standards Authority. What was the reason for that, and what would the change benefit?
So it's to set up a media ombudsman, and the Broadcasting Standards Authority would fall in or change and come in under the office. It's really to give that office way more teeth.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And a question at the front.
Kia ora koutou. You made the comments at the beginning of the session, which I totally agree with, about the importance of our media reflecting our identity and representing us. It's inarguable. You also talked about social cohesion and the importance of the media, inarguable. The thing that's missing, it seems to me, is about an informed public, because a strong democracy relies completely on an informed public. My question to you is, how well do you think, at the moment, the media is delivering current affairs as opposed to news?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the role of the Fourth Estate is to not only show us the trajectory of our flight as a nation, but also the tenor of it. And I don't believe we're totally seeing that at the moment. I think there's been a dumbing down of our media, and I think we all agree with that. And I think that's the thing that's eroding our trust in the media, that's eroding our democracy, and that's something we all have to be extremely concerned about.
I think, public media plays a huge role in being able to slow down and tell stories in a format that actually is not always enabled in other ways. And so I think that's one argument for better, more secure funding. The other one actually is, it goes also back to having an informed public, also comes back to, for example, the fact we don't have civic education in schools yet. And so therefore, when people are consuming media and they come from an education background where we don't even have civics, it also means that we're already starting with a public that isn't equipped with the tools to assess the kind of media they're consuming. So this is why I think having, for example, civics in schools will also enrich how the public engages with the media content that they consume. But to your point, I agree with Jenny that we should be doing more to enable different types of formats that create spaces for also education and understanding.
Kia ora. I agree with Jenny in parts, you know, although I think Jack Tame's a fantastic interviewer. And I think he's probably the best I've seen, actually. And look, I've had the odd ding-dong with Jack, but, brilliant interviewer. And I do think, you know, in terms of what Jenny's saying, though, is I think we can do a bit, I think we can do a bit better. I do. I think we can do a bit better. Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. But we've got some real talent amongst them. I'm talking about Jack. Who could argue with how good John Campbell is? I mean, you're talking brilliant journalists, and if you go across, from our Māori perspective, people like Mihi Forbes in there, you get some exceptional broadcasters, Julian Wilcox, it's really, so I go across the spectrum, and I think one of the problems we have is that our current affairs programs are stuck in ghettoised times. When you ever think about that, and always in the early morning on a Sunday, being like that for years and years and years, and so we have to actually get to a point. That's right, I had a TV show many years ago, but it was also not in the greatest of times, and I think we have to value our current affairs shows, prioritise them, get them. Let's get. That's what's all part of a revamp in terms of public media. That's how I look at it, and we've had some outstanding, as I said, Māori broadcasters who aren't, who could be right at the centre of a lot of things. Look, I've supported RNZ, and I will continue to as a broadcasting minister, but I have to remind them we haven't had one Māori broadcaster from the start in the last 100 years in a prime time position on RNZ. So we could do better.
I just wanted to add to that.
Minister, is there a referendum on a 4-year election term coming up with this election?
No.
We wanted one. New Zealand First wanted to put a referendum at this election to have an immediate 4-year term. But I'd just like to come back to that problem that we have had with New Zealand On Air. Probably 8-10 years ago, they stopped wanting to fund current affairs. They stopped wanting to fund documentaries because they were wanting to dabble here, there and everywhere. So if we don't have the funder putting money into current affairs programs and those kinds of documentaries, then we're not going to have these stories told.
That's not entirely fair because they won't fund it unless there's a commitment from a broadcaster.
But if you still get the commitment from the broadcaster...
Prime time current affairs with a Māori presenter? Yeah, right.
I think the gentleman probably wasn't on mic, but he's making an important point that New Zealand On Air can only fund content when it has a guarantee of distribution. And one of the big problems that a lot of independent producers come across, both Maori and Pākehā, is that when you've got a good idea for a program and you take it to the broadcasters, they're only interested in accepting it and scheduling it if it will rate.
So there was
a lot of content never gets made.
There was a program of Māori documentaries that were on Māori television. They received a notice from New Zealand On Air said, actually, we're cutting that. They were funding 15 documentaries a year. I think I'd have to check my number on that. And they were told by New Zealand On Air, sorry, we're not doing that program anymore.
Yep. Sorry, did you want to have a comment, Ricardo?
No. I just realised the gentleman was blocking the camera.
We're really up for time, unfortunately. So I think there's probably time for maybe one or possibly two very last questions.
Thanks, Peter.
David, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, my comment and question follows from what you were saying, and it does reflect my experience as a producer. I'm on record as saying that I think in our current structure, New Zealand On Air is the best thing we've got in terms of broadcasting media. The funding agencies, with their limited funding, and I include Film Commission and Te Manga Paho in that, do a pretty good job. And the levy will help. It'll increase the amount of money available. But the fact is, it's not enough, because the settings are wrong. The settings are skewed towards commercial imperatives. They're not skewed towards public media, even though New Zealand On Air is there to fund public media. Better Public Media, I'm just going to be a minute or two more, Peter, I'm sorry. Better Public Media did a survey about a year ago in which over 70% of respondents agreed that RNZ and TVNZ should operate independently of commercial pressures. RNZ operates independently of commercial pressures, but TVNZ is a commercial beast. And the decisions it makes regarding the content it chooses to run is subject to commercial decision making. That's understandable because it's commercial. Now the problem in the settings is that New Zealand On Air provides funding to content that is supported pretty much wholly by commercial platforms. Not totally, but pretty much. And it's not just that, it's that this is the point I'm getting to. This is the bit that I'd like you to address. The platforms are required to make a contribution to the content that's funded by New Zealand On Air. In effect, they're buying the right, and I know this is a pretty bald way of putting it, they're buying the right for the public funding to be used through their commercial contribution. It's just totally wrong, and it skews the system. Now, I want to acknowledge that the Greens are a little bit seeking to address this in their policy by suggesting that we permit New Zealand On Air to adjust the broadcaster's contribution. Ricardo, it's not equity. It's called a license fee traditionally, to a lower level in specific priority genres, e.g. children's content, in order to directly contribute to genre audience priority. Why just for certain genres? Why don't we get rid of this crazy anomaly whereby broadcasters are making a commercial contribution, in effect, as I said, buying the right for the public to get the content they want supported, which is subject to their commercial pressures. It does not support public funding, public media values, and I'd really like to hear what you've each got to say about that.
Comments from the panel?
No, I don't disagree too much with what you're saying. I mean, you come in from my own position, you come in as a minister and the structure's already there. And so my position is I can't reshape the whole thing in 16 to 18 months. You can only make the most of what you got in front of you. So it's all, so the whole model is, as you know, with the merger, we were, what were we, 200 million short a year? 200 million short a year. I mean, what you're talking about is the absolute ideal, and I support the principle of what you're talking about, but it's about trying to, you got to actually get there. You got to change the philosophy of governments, don't you? Who absolutely support a public media philosophy, but then that commercial side comes into it, and it almost becomes impossible to manage. It almost becomes impossible to manage, and that's where we had critics in terms of the mergers, that we wanted to do two things, weren't we? RNZ, you don't have to make any money, but TVNZ, you'll make the money. That was the merger, wasn't it? And we're coming together as one entity, and we wanted to give it a go. But if you really want to do it properly, you're talking about the absolute ideal model, which I think is going to take some time, because you got to convince a few people that that should be the way. And some will say that's just, that's just too puritanical. Like I come into a system, mate. I came from a Māori party, right? I was the leader of a Māori party and come into a system and realise that you're just going to have to take bits and pieces here because you're not going to get the absolute pure form that you want. You're not going to get the absolute funding that you want, so you've got to grab what you can and do the best within the system. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do. But I understand where you're coming from and support the principle.
And I think what you've described is decades of austerity when it comes to funding public media, right? And that's where we've landed in terms of what you've described. So on top of, I think, to steer things around, it's about A, having secure funding, B, then looking at the systemic stuff that the minister was talking about. So in principle, yeah, like agree with the sentiments. It's about, but I think securing decent long-term funding for public media is, in my view, the first step towards then having those more systemic conversations you're describing.
Yeah. Jenny, did you have a comment?
Just very briefly, I think, where the country is faced with the fiscal challenges before it, this is not something that New Zealand First would be looking at this time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, maybe we can just stretch things and we'll have one last very quick question from Zoom.
Cool, thank you. This is from Comp Lid. I'm not sure, here we go, Gerard Liddell. He says, primarily we need public broadcasting to coordinate our nation's discussions. We need to separate disinformation from hate speech. Media Watch reports the systemic disinformation promulgated by the elements of NZME and other outlets. When statements are made that lack any justification and are in conflict with accepted evidence, then public media need a coordinated response. This does not conflict with the freedom to make statements, but when they can offer no basis for their statements, then we should limit their reiteration and amplification until new grounds are advanced. Will you support a public broadcaster that provides a forum for our national dialogues?
National dialogue. Any responses? If I can extrapolate from the comment maybe to give it a focus, because we do have to wrap up fairly soon. Do you see public media as having a key fact-checking function?
Of course, yeah. And I think that's a huge role of public media, in fact. Yeah.
Fact-checking, but also ensuring that there's a whole lot less opinion, because we know opinion is cheap. It's cheap labour. And free labour in many cases, that's right. So I think, I think there's a lot more we could do to ensure that we have a media that we can trust.
Okay. Willie?
And just finally, I think being as basic figures in TV shows isn't an opinion, just FYI.
Yeah, you got no problem with fact-checking and whatnot. And I have no problem with opinions too. I suppose it just depends whose opinion it is. Right? There's a certain bloke on ZB, I don't know if I want to hear his opinion too much, but he's so popular it isn't funny, isn't it? So, it's all subjective, I suppose. Anyway, kia ora everyone, thanks very much. It's been a privilege.
So we have to bring things to a close, unfortunately, but a huge thank you to Honourable Willie Jackson, Ricardo Menéndez March and Jenny Marcroft for taking the time to come and talk to us. Very, very much appreciate your presence and your wisdom. And thanks to everyone in the audience, both here in New Lynn Community Centre and indeed on Zoom. So thank you very much all.